When your orchid has finished blooming, the best thing you can do for him is this. Not doing this is one of the 10 mistakes that is stopping yours from flowering again, or even worse, killing him, that I'll go over in this video. So I know that the common advice out there is to trim the flower spike to the next unopened bud, so that it sends a signal to the plant to start a fresh batch of blooms from there. But in my experience, it's only best to do this once, and then when that batch of flowers has finished, cut the whole thing off. Basically, an orchid goes through a cycle. There is the flowering cycle, which takes a lot of energy for the plant to produce, and then there is the rest and recuperation period. This rest and recuperation period is vital so that we get a decent batch of flowers on the next cycle, which may be in a few months. And if we delay this rest period by repeatedly pruning the flower spike, then we're going to end up with a tired plant. I pruned this guy's 2 flower spikes a few months ago. As soon as they finished blooming, it looks like I've now been rewarded with a brand new spike. This guy I trimmed back at the same time, and I'm still waiting. I know it's nice to get a second batch of blooms or more on the same spike, but for me it's all about the long game. Let the orchid rest by soaking in that sunlight, growing leaves and developing a stronger root system. You'll have a healthy orchid for years to come. Now, when it does come to that rest period, there are a few things that your orchid will want from you. The main one being to not be sat in the dark. Your little orchid has used up a lot of its stored energy sending out a flower spike. During that time, it's not really had a chance to grow roots and leaves. It's like a mother being devoted to a newborn for 18 years. She's just no time for herself in all that time. Anyway, a truly thriving orchid is one that has lots of green leaves that soak up the sun, store energy, and then use that energy to bloom. And that's what those leaves are there for, to soak up as much of the sun as they can, as if they've got their own little solar panels. I know they look a bit ugly when they haven't got any flowers on, but do try to keep them in a nice bright spot in your home. Even a couple of hours of direct sun on the leaves can work wonders, but I wouldn't let him fry in the sun for hours and hours. I keep most of mine here in my office, which does have its own challenges as I'll come to in a bit, but this is just about bright enough for them to recharge their batteries. Now, there is a caveat to all of this that you really need to be aware of. I mentioned that you shouldn't let yours fry in the sun for hours and hours because this will burn the leaves and damage the roots, but also that you should still find as bright a spot as possible for them. That applied to when the orchid was not in bloom. When your orchid is flowering, you'll want to keep him in a much lower light spot, and especially at a direct sun. Sounds weird, I know, but the aim of the game here is to prolong blooms, and as anyone in the flowering business knows, to prolong blooms, you should keep out a bright light. Bright light actually encourages a faster metabolism, and this will cause flowers to fade much more quickly. And I had no idea about this for years and years, and I always wondered why my orchid's flowers didn't last that long. It turns out this was the reason. So set him further back from the window. Don't stick him in a dark cupboard or anything daft, just give a little less light. I've had this yellow chappie next to my TV for a good couple of months now, and he's still blooming for me. He's even developing a brand new spike. Now, the next mistake to avoid is not downloading my plant troubleshooting guide that is linked in the description. It'll help you diagnose common plant problems and it's completely free. Check it out. While we're on the subject of prolonging blooms, let's talk about one of the worst things you can do for the longevity of the flowers. Doing this will turn them brown and crispy in no time, dramatically shortening their life. Yep, misting. I'm not really sure why folks do this, but I've seen it done plenty and I still pull out my hair in frustration whenever I see it. Well, what's left of it anyway. I guess folks are wanting to increase humidity for their orchid like they might do for their other plants, but honestly, misting does nothing to increase humidity in any meaningful way. I mean, it will get the thing wet, but it won't change the air humidity around the plant for much longer than a minute or two at best. Instead, what you're actually doing is causing spots on the flowers from the water droplets as they dry on the petals, and even worse, encouraging fungus and bacteria to develop on the plant. And I know what you're thinking, if water on the flowers is so bad, then how do they fare so well out in the rain? The difference is air changes. Things dry much slower and the air is much more stagnant indoors than the great outdoors. So that brings us neatly onto watering, one of the most confusing parts of orchid care, and I've been there. It used to really confuse the bejesus out of me too. I mean, what's the best way to give them a drink? They don't have any soil after all, do they? when they dry out immediately. But then I looked into how they grow in the wild and discovered that they're epiphytes. This is just a fancy term for a plant that grows on other plants for support, normally a tree in the case of the orchid, using it as a kind of perch. Now the key thing to know here is that epiphytes get their moisture and nutrients from the air, rain and debris around them. They cling to tree branches and let the roots breathe in the open air. They're not getting water from soil like most other plants, and this is why they're often popped into pots with bark and not soil. So don't think of them in the same way as your other plants. It's enough to wet the bark every week or so, and Mr. Orchid will be plenty happy with that. We certainly don't want to be drowning them in the pot. There are two ways that I think are best to water an orchid, and both of them can leave you in a spot of bother if you're not careful. We're talking yellowing leaves, leaf drop, and eventually a plant that looks something like this. Option 1 is to take your orchid over to the sink and pour water all over the bark. Let everything drain away so that he doesn't sit in a puddle in his pot until you get to him again next week. Option 2 is to leave your guy in his decorative pot and fill it with water. Leave him in there for a good hour or so to get a good soak, and then don't forget to discard the water. So what's the danger? Well, in both cases it's easy to get the crown wet. Now, getting the crown wet isn't a disaster by itself, but continually getting it wet week after week and doing nothing to dry it when we do is the quickest way to kill an orchid. It goes back to air changes. There just isn't enough of them to dry out the crane in a speedy enough time frame, and eventually the plant will succumb to rot. That's what happened to this guy. RIP, little man. Be armed with some kitchen towel and dry off the worst of the wetness. No need to get the hairdryer out though, silly. Righto, let's now talk about one of the silliest things we can do to our orchid. Yeah, this. I mean, why? What is this trying to do? I actually don't know, so I asked ChatGPT and here's what he says. People water orchids with ice mainly because it's marketed as an easy no-mess method, especially for beginners. The idea is that placing a few ice cubes on top of the potting mix slowly melts away and gives the plant a small controlled amount of water, reducing the risk of over-watering. Well, I've never heard anything so ridiculous. It's surely not that hard to take an orchid to the sink and wet the bark, and that's all there is to it. I mean, how are you supposed to know if you've given the poor thing a big enough drink? It doesn't sound like all the roots will get their drink, does it? And then, surely orchids hate ice. I mean, they're tropical and they've probably never seen the stuff. Just save it for the pina colada. I have heard that this helps to trigger flowering because apparently they need a cold snap, but I don't really buy that. Mine has started blooming again and I didn't need ice to trick him. So you probably noticed that your orchid tends to grow a bit wild, doesn't he? Weird alien-like roots growing out of the pot, making your living room look untidy. It's tempting to prune these off to smarten up the appearance, but honestly, this would be a bad idea. Sure, orchid roots can and should be pruned. This is usually reserved for roots in the pot that have gone black and mushy. We definitely want to get rid of those. But those silvery roots that are protruding out of the pot and into the air should in an ideal world be left alone. I actually think they look pretty endearing. They're helping the little fella draw in moisture from the air as well as helping to anchor the plant in the pot. Plus, if you manage to drown yours and the root system turns to mush, having these aerial roots might mean a difference between him staying alive and going to his grave. I've touched on this next mistake already, but I do think it's worth making a meal of. I mentioned that orchids are epiphytes, plants that perch and anchor themselves onto other trees, so it's super important that we choose the right potting mix. Never use soil, compost, coconut coir or anything similar. All of these will suffocate the roots in no time. The roots want air above everything else, and if we pop them into soil and then water like a normal houseplant, this will be a disaster. Most of the time, they will be sat in a pot of bark, so just make sure to repot him into bark again. Sometimes though, they are sat in sphagnum moss, I guess to mimic the moss on the tree that they would grow on and in the wild. I'm not much of a fan of moss though, because it tends to hold on to moisture for too long. So when they do outgrow the pot, it's worth considering changing the mix to orchid bark. So as mentioned in the wild, orchids like to grow high up in trees and not in rich soil. This means they don't have constant access to loads of nutrients. Instead, they survive on the tiny amounts of minerals that come from the rainwater, bird droppings and decaying leaves that get caught in the tree bark. Now, there are tons of orchid-specific fertilizers on the market, and so you might be tempted to overdo it with the stuff, but that would be a big mistake. Feeding at every watering is way more than they're used to, and it can burn their roots or mess with their ability to absorb water. So instead, think of fertilizing like seasoning food. Just a little sprinkle now and then goes a long way. Use a weak fertilizer and do it sparingly, especially when they're in flowering mode. I actually don't bother with these orchid-specific fertilizers. They seem to do just fine with a normal houseplant focus. This video goes over the growth stages of orchids in more detail and how that affects how you should care for him. So make sure you watch it next, and I'll see you there.